Hello and welcome to the last video in our financial math section. The topic of this video is adjustable rate loans and refinancing. So here are two goals. The first goal is essentially saying that you should be able to analyze what happens after an interest rate change in an adjustable rate loan. And the second goal is that we'll be able to analyze the consequences of refinancing. So here's a typical refinancing question that you might have to answer, and we will answer at the end. This person has a 5-year auto loan, 16 grand, 4% APR. 2 years into the loan, the bank comes up to Terry and says, we'll lower your interest rate to 2.5%. It'll just cost you a closing fee of $400. And the question is, should Terry do this or not? Okay, so the most natural place to start this video is with the definition of adjustable rate loan. It's pretty self-explanatory. An adjustable rate loan is simply a loan in which the interest rate can change. So let's start analyzing these things with an example. So this is a small example, only 4 payments. So Keegan takes out a 1-year loan of 3 grand. He's going to repay it with 4 quarterly payments. So there are only 4 payments here. The initial APR is 3%. After the first 2 payments, the APR becomes 7%. So to really analyze what's going on here, I'm going to build an amortization table. I'm going to build the table quickly because we already know how to build these tables. So the construction will go pretty fast here. So if you want to build a table, the first thing you need to do is figure out what the payment amount is. And so the first thing you do is you do 3 grand for 1 year with 4 quarterly payments at an interest rate of 3%. So if you do that, 3 grand for a year quarterly, so N is 4, with an APR of 0.03, the number that pops out is 764.12. And then with that 764.12, you take 3% of it for a quarter of a year, so 0.25 of a year, and the principal is 3 grand, and the interest amount you get is $22.50. Etc. So the rest of this table construction goes for the first 2 rows, just like you've done before. So then what happens? Well, after the second payment, when you owe $15.11.20, the interest rate jumps to 7%. So if you fill in 764.12 right here in this box and this box, what you'll discover is that this number right here for remaining balance won't be 0. Okay, the reason it won't be 0 is because once the interest rate rises, 764.12 won't pay off the loan in the same time period as it used to. So if the interest rate didn't go up, then you would write 76.412 right here, and you would end up with a remaining balance of 0 at the end. But since the interest rate has gone up, 764.12 won't cut it anymore. You're actually going to need a larger payment in order to finish the loan in just 2 more payments. So let's figure out what that new payment is. Well, you figure it out using the loan formula that relates principal to payment. So what happens here is the bank says, okay, Keegan, you owe us $15.11.20, and there are 6 months left on your loan, and you're going to pay quarterly. So they essentially just treat it like it's a brand new loan. It's a brand new loan where the principal is $15.11.20, the time period is 6 months, the APR is now 7%, so 0.07 down here, and it's still quarterly payments. So that's what happens when there's an interest rate either jump or fall. You take whatever you still owe, and then you essentially just treat it like a new loan with that principal amount for whatever time period is left on the original loan. So the original loan was 1 year long. So this new loan resets as a 6-month loan because you've already traversed 6 months of time. So when I plug all those numbers in and I solve for the payment, I get $775.49. So I put those 2 numbers up here in these 2 boxes. From there, the construction of the table goes, again, just like you've done before. If you want to figure out how much interest goes here, well, you take the remaining balance, multiply it by the APR, which in this case is 7% and not 3% anymore, and multiply it by a quarter of a year, and you'll get $26.45. And then the rest of the table goes like this. So you end up with nothing in the end, which is what you're supposed to end up with, right? You're supposed to have repaid the loan after a year. And the only way you could get down to zero is by having a higher payment right here. So that's how these things work. So um, once an interest rate either rises or falls, you have to figure out how much you still owe, and then it's essentially like taking out a new loan of that amount with a new time period, a new shorter time period. In this case, the new loan was 6 months long. Okay, so let's compare and contrast the interest between an interest rate jump and no interest rate jump. So in the loan we just did, if we want to figure out the total interest, we'll just add up the 4 interest amounts. So just add up this column, and we get $79.24. So that's how much interest he paid on this adjustable rate loan. Suppose that the interest rate hadn't gone up. Then this amortization table is what you would have gotten. If the rate doesn't go up, then the payment amount also doesn't go up. Right, so the payments are all just the same now. So I constructed the table, and if I add up the interest payments now, I get $56.45. So to get from 56 to 79 is 23 bucks. So this interest rate jump cost him $23. Okay, so because that's the difference in the amount of interest he's paying. There's a $23 increase from non-adjustable to adjustable. So you might be thinking $23 isn't that much money, right? And I suppose that's true, but think about it in terms of relative percentages. So here, $23 is half of 56. So going from 56 to 79 is a 50% increase. Okay, so this interest rate jump cost him a 50% increase in the amount of interest he pays. Okay, so a 50% increase in general is huge. So imagine that the original loan were bigger and the time period were longer, which is true of a lot of loans, right? Auto loans, house loans, student loans, etc. all have a lot more payments and are usually a lot more than whatever the amount was originally, $3,000, right? So imagine now taking a much longer loan for a much longer amount, a much longer time period, and increasing the amount of interest you pay by 50%. Okay, the numbers can become staggering depending on the example that you do. Okay, so here's sort of a real life example. The last example wasn't terribly realistic. Usually you don't have quarterly payments that end up with an adjustable rate for only a year, etc. That was just sort of a toy example. So here's a real example. Dan and Janine take out a 30-year mortgage of $275,000 in 2005. And the kind of loan they took out was a 327 ARM, which means that after 3 years, the interest rate is going to reset to a market rate. So in this scenario, they started with an interest rate of 2.5%, and then the rate that it resets to is 6.5%. Okay, so when they took out the ARM, the adjustable rate mortgage, they don't know this number in advance. Okay, typically you don't know the number it's going to jump to. It's determined by the market. But what typically happens in these kinds of loans is the bank gives you a very enticing low interest rate. So 2.5% is very low on a mortgage. So the probability that the rate will jump is very high, right? Because it's going to reset to a market rate, and market rates aren't this low. So how high it jumps is pretty unpredictable, but the probability is extremely high that it will jump. So this scenario here is pretty realistic. So here's the question. Assuming they made the minimum monthly payments for the first 3 years, what is their new payment when the interest rate jumps? So just like with our first example, when there's an interest rate jump, the payment also has to jump if you're going to pay off the loan in the same amount of time. Okay, this is a 30-year mortgage. So even though the interest rate jumped, they still have to pay off the loan in 30 years. So the payment will also rise. And just a quick note here, a lot of subprime mortgages were adjustable rate in this manner. A lot of people were given low and enticing initial interest rates and then got slammed with a much higher interest rate 2, 3, or 5 years down the road with a corresponding payment increase. Okay, so before I show you how to do this, let's just talk through the logic of what happens here. So when they first take out this loan, it's 30 years long, 275 grand, and the APR is 2.5%. So their monthly payment is calculated based on those parameters. After 3 years, when the interest rate jumps, we have to know the remaining balance, just like we had to know it with the Keegan example. So when the interest rate jumps, essentially the loan starts over, and the bank treats it like a new loan that's now 27 years long because you've already traversed 3 years. So this new loan is 27 years long, the APR is 6.5%, and the principal is how much you still owe them after 3 years. So if we want to answer this question, we have to figure out how much they still owe after 3 years. If we can figure out the remaining balance after 3 years, we will just take, we'll figure out the loan payment based on that, the APR of 6.5%, and the time period of 27 years. So in these slides, which are on Moodle, I've done the work by hand. So here's their initial payment amount, and that's based on 275 grand for 30 years, APR of 2.5%. And with that payment amount, you can figure out how much they still owe after 3 years. They still owe quite a bit. Okay, they've reduced 275 down to 256 or so. Once you know that remaining balance, then your new mortgage payment will be based off of a principal of 256 grand, a time period of 27 years, and an APR of 6.5%. And when I plug those numbers into the formula, I get this as a mortgage payment. Okay, $1,677.03. So what happened was their original payment was $1,086.58. Using that payment, they still owe 256 grand 3 years later. Now using this remaining balance as a principal, I get that their new payment is $1,677.03. Okay, so if you were to do this by hand, it may or may not take you a while. It depends on how comfortable you are with the computations and specifically how comfortable you are with your calculator. So I had to use, I had to do 3 different computations. To get this first number, this payment amount, I had to use the loan formula. Then I had to use the remaining balance formula. Then I had to use the loan formula again to get this final payment. So it was a 3-step process using the loan formula twice and the remaining balance formula once. That can take some time. So what's faster is doing this all on the bank rate calculator, the loan calculator. So for example, to get that 1086.58 number is pretty easy with this calculator. You just tell it 275 grand, 30 years, and the APR was 2.5%. And bam, there it is, right? 1086.58. If you want to know the remaining balance after 3 years, it will also do that if you're willing to just scroll down an amortization table. So it builds the table for you. So let's see, it's starting me in August. So 12 payments later, I'm here in July. So a full year cycle is August to July. So 1 year is August 2014 to July 2015. So if I want to go 3 full years, I need to go down to July 2017. And so here's the row I care about. Oh, and the remaining balance is 255,817.65, which again is what I got already. Now what do? You take that number, 255,817.65, that's your new principal amount. So just come back up here where it's going to calculate payments for you and type in 217.80, and I've already done this, right? 255,817.65. The new time period is 27 years because you're 3 years into it. The new interest rate is 6.5%. And now ask it to calculate your new payment. And you get $1,677.03, which we already got. So you see how fast that was, right? If you're just willing to use this calculator, you can get an answer in 45 seconds. So that's that's what I would advise that you do to answer a question like this. And that's what you will be able to do on your exam. So on your exam, this kind of question shouldn't take a ton of time. Okay, so we've answered the original question. What's their new mortgage payment? Generally, when you're asked a question like this, I will follow it up with some interest questions. So the first thing I want to do is figure out how much interest would they have paid if their interest rate had never risen. Okay, so back on this slide, we learned that their original mortgage payment was $1086.58. So let's just suppose that the interest rate had never risen. That means that they're going to pay $1086.58 for the entire loan. Right? If the interest rate doesn't change, then the payment doesn't change. So if you pay $1086.58 monthly for 30 years, you will end up paying $391,168.80. So the interest, of course, is that amount with the principal taken out. Right? The original loan was $275,000, and the interest you get is $116,168.80. Okay. Now, after the interest rate jump, you've paid $1086.58 monthly for 3 years, and then you paid $1677.03 for 27 years. So for the first 3 years, you paid $1086.58 monthly for 3 years, and that totals to $39,116.58. Now, for the next 27 years, you're paying $1677.03 monthly for 27 years. That number comes out to $543,357.72. Right? Ouch. So the total amount that you pay in interest, the total amount that you pay is the total amount from the first 3 years plus the total amount from the next 27 years, and you get a grand total of $582,474.30. So when you take that amount and subtract off your principal, you get an interest amount of $307,474.30. I mean, this is staggering, right? This should really kind of smack you in the face. I mean, the total interest difference, right? You were paying approximately $116,000. Now you're paying more than $300,000 in interest. So the amount of interest that you're going to have to pay essentially triples here. Okay, that's a 200% increase over what you would have had to pay. So these adjustable rate mortgages can really cripple you, right? I mean, they're not all bad, and they don't all end up with numbers this staggering, but for 27 years, you're essentially going to have to find an extra $600 a month to pay your mortgage. And finding an extra $600 a month is not trivial for a lot of people. And so, of course, if you compare these two numbers, 1086.58 to 1677.03, that's approximately a 50% increase to go from one to the other. So you're increasing your monthly payment by 50%, and you're essentially tripling the amount of interest you'll pay. Okay, so a lot of families who took out these adjustable rate mortgages, subprime mortgages, whatever, before the housing crash, really found themselves crippled by these interest rate raises. So let's finish by quickly thinking about refinancing. So here's that original question. Terry has a 5-year car loan of $16,000 at 4%, and with these parameters, his monthly car payment is $294.66. You could get this number from the loan calculator, which again, if I were you, I would do because it's so fast. And 2 years into the loan, the bank offers Terry the chance to lower his interest rate to 2.5% for a fee of $400. And by the way, this is usually what happens. If you want to refinance, which means lowering your interest rate, although it doesn't have to mean lowering your interest rate, but why would you want to raise your interest rate on a loan, right? So we're talking about lowering your interest rate. They will generally charge you what they might call closing costs or a refinancing fee, whatever. So usually it's not free to lower your interest rate. Usually they'll charge you something, a processing fee, whatever. So the question here is it a good idea for Terry to refinance like this? I mean, they're almost cutting his interest rate in half, going from 4 to 2, basically 4 to 2.5. So it's a pretty significant interest rate drop. So the question is, should he do it? And assume that he's always making minimum monthly payments. So let's see what happens. We're going to do what we just did a second ago, but now the interest rate will drop. So let's analyze what happens. Well, 2 years into the loan, I got that his remaining balance was $10,000, and I just got this from the bank rate calculator. Okay, so I wouldn't do this by hand. And I got that after his interest rate dropped. So what happens is, this is the new principal. He has now a new loan that's 3 years long at 2.5%. I got that his new monthly payment is this, $288.05. Okay, so if I were Terry, I would think to myself, okay, how much interest am I paying on this loan without refinancing? So just leaving the original interest rate in place. Well, the total amount of money I pay is $294.66 monthly for 5 years. And if I take the principal amount out of that, then without refinancing, I'm paying approximately $1,700 in interest. So now let's see what the interest is with refinancing. Well, if I refinance, then I pay $294.66 for 2 years. Then I pay $288.05 for 3 years. So I add those two guys together. That's the total amount I pay. I subtract off the principal, and this is now the amount of interest I pay. Okay, so without refinancing, I'm paying approximately $1,700. With refinancing, I'm paying approximately $1,400. Okay, notice that if I take the difference between these two interest amounts, I get approximately $250. Okay, so refinancing saves you about $250. So the question is, why would I pay $400 to save myself $250? Right? That doesn't make any sense. So if I were Terry, I would not accept this deal. Right? It looks like a pretty significant drop, 4% to 2.5%, but it doesn't save me $400. It doesn't even save me $300. Right? It saves you about $250. Yeah, so by refinancing, he only saves $237.96 in interest. So he probably shouldn't do that, right? So that last situation was pretty unambiguous, okay? They're charging him more to refinance than he's going to save. So let's remember this number, $237.96. So suppose the bank said, well, okay, we're only going to charge you $200 to refinance. Should he do it then? Well, now the answer is actually not so clear. Now the answer is not an obvious no, right? You don't just say no immediately. But it's not a clear yes, actually, because there are some questions he could ask. Well, I could pay that $200 now, but what if I could invest it for a certain APR, right? What if I could sink this $200 into a mutual fund that's getting 5%, 3%, whatever? Then you might still be better off just doing that than saving $37 or whatever it was, right? Another consideration to think about is, what if that $200 is all you have in savings, right? Is it worth emptying your savings account just to save yourself some interest on a loan? And I guess I should say that $200 is actually really cheap for certain refinancing. So I know people who refinance their mortgages and it costs them like $3,500. Right? So even if that $3,500 saves you a bunch of interest, if that $3,500 is all you have in savings, it's probably not worth emptying your savings to save yourself interest down the road. Right? If you have no savings, you're very vulnerable. So if you do this refinancing deal and now suddenly your car breaks down and you can't afford to fix it, that was a bad idea. So in general, there is no great answer to whether or not you should refinance. There are many things to reconsider. But at the very least, this original question, the answer is an unambiguous no. You're not even saving in interest what you're paying. So it's not worth it for you. And that's the end of this.